Alright, so today we got a little video on the medieval kingdoms. I'm talking China, Africa, and then Mesoamerica, specifically the Olmecs and the Mayans. So we are not going to be talking too much about Europe today, really just trying to give you a overview, and we won't go in depth, but there are some things that I want to point out. So here we go. First, we have talked about the Tang Dynasty, the Zhao a little bit, the Qin Dynasty with legalism and Shi Huangdi, and then we really tried to hammer out the Han Dynasty. And to do that, we looked at Mulan a little bit, and we just looked about the culture of the Han. Today, we're going to try to focus on the Sui, the Tang, and the Song. So the Sui, the Tang, and the Song dynasties. So before we do that, let's just try to remember some things about Chinese culture and Han China, because they're sort of the bedrock of Chinese culture. So if we understand them, then we can sort of build our understanding. So the Han gave us early paper and writing things down. They developed the ship rudder, which will be instrumental in future exploration, especially during the Ming Dynasty. We've got the process of steel making, which the Tang Dynasty will use to create steel swords. We've got the civil service exams and the meritocracy idea, basically that people in government were chosen because of skill, not necessarily because of their last name. Okay, it's not like European feudalism where you're sort of born into this position and you stay there. There's a little bit of social mobility, which is a good thing, right? On the far right, we did talk about there is a feudal system, but again, there's just a little bit more movement in that pyramid to the far right as opposed to a European feudalism pyramid. And then in the middle, you've got something called the Silk Road, and when I say Silk Road, you should say, of course, cultural diffusion. You got it. Okay. And briefly, we talked about how the Han people fell. They fell because of their wills, because of a weak central government, an invasion from the north. I'm talking about the Huns, right? We talked about how land distribution wasn't so fair, that a few people had a large slice of the land that was in Han China. And then last but not least, the villages got stronger and the emperors got weaker. Not everyone was as strong as Han Gaozu. We also talked about how during that invasion from the north, that's where Disney got the story of Mulan, and how Mulan dressed up as a man and fought in service of her father, and there was no dragons. Okay? All right. So, the Sui dynasty, we go kind of fast. And the Sui, for us, in terms of our global understanding of what the Sui are able to do for the Chinese people, is they are able to reunify the kingdom. And then they create what is called the Grand Canal. And there are some parallels to be made. Sui Yangdi, who is the emperor at the time and helps to build the canal, he uses slave labor. He is very, very violent. Reminds you of a Shi Huangdi, where if you're not going to work on the canal, they'll kill you on the spot. Remember, when Shi Huangdi started the Great Wall, he would just throw the people who died on the Great Wall, and they'd throw them right underneath it and just keep building. It was sort of this nasty stuff going on. But when you think of Shi Huangdi, I hope you're thinking of legalism, which is strict rules, harsh punishment. And eventually the Sui fall, like the Chinese dynasties do in that dynastic cycle. There becomes high taxes, some abuse of power, and eventually a rebellion. So enter the Tang Dynasty a little bit later. And the Tang Dynasty create inventions that are going to allow them to expand. And in that way, I want you to understand that the Tang are your militaristic group, okay? They help to create a golden age, because look at that expansion, my gosh. And they expanded to north and western China. And you can look at geography as to what limits them. If you look out there towards the western side of the Tang Dynasty, where it says China in the middle of the map, well, you've got the Gobi Desert there, and that's going to make it very difficult for them to expand that way. In their government system, the Tang Dynasty rekindle in many ways the old Confucian ideas, the old Han civil service exams, the idea of filial piety, respect of your elders, the idea of the 5 relationships, that the ruled must respect the ruler, that the wife must obey the husband, that the younger brother should obey the older brother, right? Those relationships that we've already talked about are going to guide them. They decide to give more land to the peasants. Now, the reason they can do that is because they are taking over more land. They believed in having a landowning class that was smart. And in this way, they create the scholar gentry. Now, when I talk about civil service exams, we say, are they equitable? Are they good for all people? And in this case, the civil service exams, you have to have money to be able to take and study for those exams, and money to go to school and all that kind of stuff. So, is it true meritocracy? Probably not. Okay, but maybe they're a little bit ahead of some of the other peoples that we've already covered and discussed in this class. Last but not least, we have a long discussion in my class about the price of beauty and what Americans do to make themselves more beautified. And in China, there's a similar practice or concept called foot binding, which was in the same vein. The idea that to be beautiful is to have small feet. And so what they would do is they would, in many cases, break the feet of women, crack the bones, and put them into a really small shoe and compress it so that their foot would grow, but only grow in a certain spot. So basically you restrict the growth of a woman's foot, make it really, really small, and the idea is that to be a good woman, you would have to engage in foot binding. It was to reinforce the system of patriarchy, a male-dominated system amongst the Tang Dynasty. Women were in their place, and women were supposed to do this for the benefit of their husband. So think about it. There's a lot of things that we do for beauty, from tattoos. The Europeans used corsets, these tight-fitting outfits that European women were supposed to wear, and in many cases that would break ribs and things like that. So it's not, we shouldn't look at the Chinese people and look down upon them or something like that. No, I want you to be culturally open and have an open mind to this concept and this idea, and see that in all cultures we do things for the price of beauty, and that each culture's got its different societal pressures and things of that nature. It doesn't mean that we don't learn from it. It just means that I don't want you to just start throwing stones when Europeans lived in glass houses, if you understand what I'm trying to say there. Okay. Inventions of the Tang. These are the militaristic ones, right? Tang, militaristic. So, their inventions are going to get carried along the Silk Road. Example of cultural diffusion. You knew it. Steel swords would be an example, where they are developing that steel process of the Han, and they're using it to make weaponry. Steel's good because it does not, I don't want to say break, but certainly it doesn't wear as easily as the iron swords do. Sharper, more resilient. Gunpowder is introduced, and of course gunpowder is going to be one of the defining inventions of humanity. It's going to be expanded upon, and the Chinese are early gunpowder. They used it for fireworks mostly, but the Europeans will take it and adapt it, and even the Chinese people themselves will adapt it as well to create what we'll know today as the modern gun. Now, they also developed an early flamethrower called the fire lance. So it's the ability to shoot heat out amongst your enemies, and that's a terrifying invention, right? So this militaristic concept of the Tang is what I want you guys to really get from this. And here's an example where cultural diffusion changes history, where the Seljuk Turks, those people who had been fighting in the Crusades for the Holy Land, right? Well, they wanted to gain access to Constantinople, because that's the middle ground. If you can get that, then the Europeans are less likely to be able to take over the Holy Land. So they go in there and they take that gunpowder and they use it to create cannons. And they use the cannons to destroy Justinian's dream city of Constantinople, or at least destroy the walls. And then they take that dream of the Hagia Sophia, that beautiful church, and they remake it into the largest Muslim mosque, and they also rename the city Istanbul. So in this case, we see that cultural diffusion has changed history. Okay? So Tang, militaristic. Now, how do they fall? We've seen this with a lot of dynasties, right? The corrupt government. The government starts to become more and more corrupt. And the emperor at the time, Tang Xuanzong, was forced to have the love of his life hanged on a tree. They sort of wanted him to show that he was a strong ruler, except he had let one of his generals become way too powerful. And so he let this general become too powerful, and so to appease the people around him, he had to show his strength. So he had the love of his life hang in front of his eyes. I can't imagine that, but it's just this moment where this ruler has to show his strength, and how awful that must have been for him. Now, once the Tang begin to fall, what will happen is the south becomes the center of culture, the center of trade, and the north sort of dwindles out. And for a time, the south and the Song are going to be the inventors, not necessarily conquerors. They're going to invent some things that are not used necessarily for conquering, some things that are going to be used by Europeans, though, to make lots and lots of money. Their capital city is Hongqiao, and Marco Polo called this city paradise because it was so far way ahead of every other city he had been to. They had street sweepers. They had a squad that dealt with fires. You know, we're talking about people who think about the modern day fire department, and way back in 960, the Tang Dynasty's got it. So really, really ahead in that way in Marco Polo City. You love the city, and you know, it was just this wonderful, wonderful place. And some things that they were able to come up with, of course, the compass. Compass is really good for exploration. Again, the Chinese later on, when we get to the Ming, are going to use the compass, and they're going to start going around and finding and discovering some new stuff. Next, this compass and the other inventions, the woodblock printing, they're going to eventually go down and become part of European culture as well. They're going to sort of, through cultural diffusion, be spread across, and the Europeans will use these inventions to open up spice routes and spice trade, and we're going to see a wave of exploration. It just takes some time for the Sung ideas to be adopted and accepted by the Europeans, and when they do, bang, it's going to open up the world. Movable type printing is really good for the Chinese people, because what you do is you take those little blocks with the characters on them, you dip them in ink, and then you can write a letter faster, or make a book faster, or newspaper, right? So you can get information out to the people a lot quicker by using those movable type printing. Other things that they create. Europeans had a taste for porcelain, specifically those bowls and cups and plates. And if you have ever seen your grandparents have these porcelain in the cabinet, they usually call them china, right? That's a European name that they just gave to it because that's where it came from. So they're just like, oh, well, that's from China, so we'll just call it china. And the Chinese were like, well, it's actually called porcelain, but okay, as long as you buy it. Number two, they're able to come up with a concept called paper money. Here's why that is really, really important. Paper money is going to contribute to the shift in history from a barter economy to using money. Specifically, Europeans were using gold currency like the ducal. Later on, they're going to start to use paper money, and this is the contribution to the commercial revolution into our modern day society. So, with all of that, you've got the Tang, who are the militaristic, you've got the Sung, who are the more of the inventors, and the Sui dynasty gave us the Grand Canal. Now I want to continue the story on. So as China is rising, so is Africa. And to understand Africa, you've got three major kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. We'll start with geography. And then what I'll try to do is break down that traditional narrative that the only thing that we need to know about Africa is the slave trade. There's so much more to Africa, and I want to sort of break down the traditional narrative and then build it back up so that you guys understand the wealth of information, the literal wealth of Africa, and of course, make sure that you have a holistic understanding of history. So to do that, we're going to break down three kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. So, let's start with African geography, right? You must know the Sahara. That is the most important thing that I need you to know. That's the Sahara Desert, where Egypt was located on, right, Nile River. Okay, that is going to contribute to Africa's great resources in terms of gold and later salt. but it's also going to be a place where they're going to have to adapt to their geography considerably. Other places, the savannah is in the central part of Africa. That's your grassland area. That's where you get all those wonderful Animal Planet shots, right in the savannah. You've also got some rainforests in there. Again, diverse amount of animals and plants. What do they call it? Flora and fauna, right? A lot of cool stuff in the middle. And then towards the far south, we're talking the Kalahari Desert. So you've got a desert to the south and a desert to the north and a lot of beauty in between. Okay? As far as culture, and of course I'm using broad strokes here, but to get an idea of African culture, number one, oral language. Their languages are not written down. They are passed from person to person. That's going to make it a little tricky when we talk about the historical record and narrative, because there's not going to be as much information as, say, the Middle Easterners or the Chinese, who write everything down, or the Jewish people who write everything down, right? So it's going to make things a little bit more tricky. You have large extended families, what we call lineage groups. So it's not just like you, your mom and dad. It's like you, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, great-grandma, great-grandpa. Okay? All living in, some hut or some house of some sort, stone or otherwise. Okay? And then here's something really interesting. And the Europeans had a lot of trouble dealing with this, and so did the Middle Easterners, who were very patriarchal themselves. The Africans believed in a matrilineal society. Females often ran the clan or the tribe or the group, okay? This is radically different from what we have been studying, which is, all male-dominated societies. But here in Africa, we've got queens. Here in Africa, we have got men deferring to women and allowing women to be in leadership roles, especially elderly women, running and making decisions for the group. So pretty cool. And if you want to make a comparison in terms of religion, look back to the Shinto shrines of Japan, where you get a little bit of that nature worship. Or look at the Native Americans, some of that animal, worship that we talked about, right? Animism. You're getting a little bit of that cross-pollination of sorts when we talk about these different religions. So it's like Shintoism, it's like animism, that kind of stuff, okay? Now, let's talk about that traditional narrative. So often it is taught in schools, and I'm not saying this one in particular, but we have to break this narrative that Columbus discovered the New World, and that's it. Okay, we've already talked about Leif Erikson and the Vikings. Okay, we've talked about that. Well, Columbus himself wrote about how in his journal he wrote that Native Americans had actually told him that they saw African people, and that they had seen people with gold-tipped spears. The Africans were so wealthy to be able to trade these gold-tipped spears suggests that maybe the Africans were already there. If that's not good enough for you, there's other evidence that even some Egyptian artifacts were found over in the New World. And so we see that the African people perhaps were going over there and coming into the New World far before the Europeans ever were. And if you're like, well, where are you getting these sources from? Well, Greek historian Herodotus, of course. I mean, the man who has given us 300, right? The man who has given us the account of Thermopylae is the same man writing about how King Ramses is sending Africans at sea and getting them across and trying to find new trade routes. So we believe Herodotus with 300, and yet for some reason we don't believe Herodotus when he says that Africans are over there exploring in the New World. And I guess I'll let you think about and ponder as to why that might be. Okay? A little bit of bias, right? Here we go. So let's talk about Ghana. Ghana is going to gain its wealth. It's that little purple area. It's small, but it's going to grow. Ghana's going to gain its wealth from the gold and the salt trade. Okay, they're on the Sahara Desert, and they begin trading with some nomads. Eventually, they'll be trading with the Umayyads, which are a Muslim dynasty to the north. Okay, and they begin trading with these Islamic folk. And what they're doing is they're going to engage in what we call the Trans-Saharan trade. I call it Trans-Saharan because it's going across the Sahara Desert. Now you must think about this for a moment. You know, Mr. Casey, why would someone trade gold, which is what the Ghana people had, to gain salt, which is what these nomads had? Why would they give up gold for salt? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it kind of does when you think about how valuable salt can be for people that live near the desert. Salt preserves food, okay? If you want to eat, you need some salt to preserve your food. There's no refrigeration at this time, so you're not going to be able to do that. And if you want to have a big population, you need to be able to have a lot of food. If you have a lot of food, you don't want it to go bad. So this is a way to preserve food and then get higher population, which is pretty good. Salt is also needed for you to live. Look at the back of your Gatorade bottles, or more importantly, your Powerade bottles, because Powerade's better than Gatorade, okay? There are electrolytes in those substances, right? Electrolytes are salt. So we take them in, and the African people needed them. So they use camels to take the gold and get the salt across. And of course they chose camels because they can get across the desert with very limited amounts of water. And it was dangerous, super, super dangerous. And if you haven't seen my Mankind, the Story of Us video, you should check it out. It's very, very dangerous with the sandstorms and just you're going across the desert. It's hot. It's brutal, right? Next, after Ghana, comes the wealthiest, perhaps, group here of Mali. And Mali founded its own city of Timbuktu, which had some of the largest libraries in the world, larger than in Alexandria. When Alexander the Great conquered that city and he made the library at Alexandria, okay, we always talk about that as like the center of learning. Well, in Timbuktu, they had their own center of learning. It was bigger and it was just as important for the African people. And they take over that trans-Saharan trade and become super, super wealthy. And they find some new gold deposits. And they birth the wealthiest man in history ever. Ever. I'm talking ever. Like right now, he's the wealthiest person that we've ever had in human history. And maybe you've never heard of him, but you should have. His name is Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa is a Muslim man from Mali. Okay? Mansa Musa is a Muslim man from Mali. Okay? Who made a pilgrimage to Mecca. How about that? And Mansa Musa is going to create and double the size of his empire. He's so wealthy that he goes to Egypt on his way to make his pilgrimage, his Hajj, right? Because Mansa Musa was an Islamic, follower. And so he goes out, he's trying to go to Mecca, and of course he's got to go through Egypt until he gets to the Middle East to get to Mecca. And he spends so much gold in Egypt that he causes inflation. He's just handing it out left and right. Because if you know your 5 pillars, say, pray, give away, fast all day, go away, then you know that part of that is to give away to charity, right? To be a Muslim person, you give away to charity. So Mansa Musa is giving away to charity. He's giving these gold away. He's spending it, of course, too. And he just destroys an economy. That's how wealthy he was. And he still had more, by the way. So very, very wealthy guy. And he makes that pilgrimage to Mecca as part of the 5 pillars. He's going to build some mosques in Timbuktu. I mean, this guy is wealthy beyond wealthy. So here's a little meme for you. Make my Hajj to Mecca. Give everyone gold on the way. Destroy the Middle East's economy. Destroy the Middle East's economy. Okay? Hope you like that one. All right, next. So if you want to talk about just how rich, how about this? He took 80 camels with him. And they carried about 300 pounds of gold each. So if you do the math on that, what's that? 24 and 3 zeros. Doing it 24,000? Yeah, 24,000. My gosh. A lot of gold. A lot of gold. If we estimate his worth out, you're talking about $400 billion in today's currency. $400 billion. And that number's only going to grow as inflation grows in America, right? But just incredibly wealthy. Last group in Africa, okay? So we haven't talked about, the African people being enslaved. We haven't talked about, horrible diseases like Ebola, going through Africa. No, we have been focusing on the wealth and beauty of their culture, that they are scholars and that they are super, super wealthy. Let's talk about Songhai and talk about them being, as a religious people go, a very dedicated Muslim people. In Songhai, Sunni Ali takes control of the trans-Saharan trade. Sunni Ali You know, you got to be thinking about the Sunni Shiite split in Islam. He's got to be a Sunni, right? And he's going to spread that Sunni Islam across North Africa. And this is the largest kingdom that we see in West Africa, and is going to be around until it's conquered by the Middle Easterners, okay? But for a very long time, these people are just taking control and making large amounts of money. Now, here's how I am able to tell you about all of this stuff. Because remember, it's a lot of oral language. And the libraries are taking control of, and it's sort of difficult. The libraries help us, but a man who helps us most is Ibn Battuta, who must have had the coolest life ever. Ibn Battuta just went around these African kingdoms, collecting data, recording what he saw, and he just went everywhere. I mean, 75,000 miles in his lifetime, and he's not like taking a bullet train. He's not flying around in his helicopter or his private jet. He's doing this by camel, he's doing this by boat, and he is having a really cool life. He says, traveling, it leaves you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller. There's a lot of truth in those words. So here's a map of just all of the places that he was able to go. Just incredible, right? That he was able to do all of this. Each route is just different years that he was traveling. So he got a lot of mileage as a human being. Lastly, to sort of round out this story, by the end of the Mali Empire, and even before that, we started to see the Sahara deserts like just growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, you know, desertification as we call it, right? More erosion and things like that. And so what a lot of African people did is they began to move south. They began to go down into the Sahel, to go down into the savannah, and they start to migrate down. Now, part of that migration, what will start to happen is these cultures of African people and a lot of the traders of the, and Traders, right, traders of the Muslims are going to come together, and they're actually going to create their own language, a language called Swahili. And Swahili is this mixture of this Arabic and African language. So here's why I'm telling you that. Number one, we see these new places and new kingdoms and new tribes being built down south. And number two, we're seeing this word that keeps coming up in history, right? What's that word, of course? But you got it, cultural diffusion. Okay, so the Bantu migration's an example of cultural diffusion, and you get this Swahili language. All right. Last group I want to talk to you about would be the people of Mesoamerica. To put this in context for you, the Mayan Civilization, 2000 BCE to 900 CE, okay? So we're like before Christ, 2,000 years, and then 900 after Christ was born. Leif Erikson arrives somewhere around 1,000. So that's the sort of context. Now, I will give you this timeline just so you can start to see what's going on in history at this time period. So I'm trying to catch you up to the rest of Europe. So we're not at the bubonic plague yet. I know I've talked to you about it before. I'm just trying to catch up everybody else to where the Europeans are. We're doing it in pieces. So let's do that. So number one, I'd like to give you a frame of reference to talk about the people known as the Olmecs. To do that, I like to spotlight a group that's not well known, but a group that you should know, which are the people of Easter Island. And I show you Easter Island because they create these wonderful, beautiful sculptures out in the middle of nowhere, really. And they are a group of people that go out and discover this island and start beginning to build these statues, perhaps for some religious importance. We're really not 100% sure. But for us, when I show you the clip of Mankind, the Story of Us, what I'm going to try to show you is that the Olmecs are similar in these ways with these giant sculptures. And at least you'll get to see how they are built in Mankind, the Story of Us. So make sure you check it out. So here are the Olmecs. They are our foundation. Yes, we're going to talk about the Mayans today, and then later we'll talk about the Aztecs, and you'll just start to see these layers. And there are a lot of similarities. So number one, the Olmecs come first, and they are people that worship nature. Okay, so you can start to think about, okay, that sounds, Shintoism, right? That sounds like there's some commonalities with Africa right there. Okay, but their animal of choice was the jaguar, and they actually had this a myth that people could, some people at night would turn into these, half man, half jaguar type creatures shown on the right hand side there. So pretty cool stuff. And they are known to have built these giant stone heads, and those stone heads were meant to honor their rulers who came before them. So something like that, right? These giant stone heads, pretty cool. Now, the Mayans will build upon everything that the Olmecs do. They'll just sort of, take the layers and just go one step further. The Olmecs develop early calendars. We'll see the Mayans do more of that. They develop early ball games. We'll see the Mayans do a little bit better. They'll use human sacrifice. And yes, the Mayans will do more. You've got the polytheistic religion. What is polytheistic? Yes, the worship of many gods. Now, that's the foundation to talk about the Mayan people. And you see there on your map, so it's like to the east of modern day Mexico, but like north of Honduras, right? North of Panama, of course, all that kind of stuff. So they organize into city-states. That should go off on your brain, right? City-states. Oh my gosh, who else organized into city-states? The ancient Greeks, right? Athens and Sparta and Thebes and Troy, all that kind of stuff. They practiced a ritual sacrifice. Later groups, like the Aztecs, are going to take that on a whole nother level, and it's like ritual sacrifice on steroids, but I got more stuff to talk to you about some other day. Now, they're polytheistic, but they had a supreme god. It was called Itzamna, which is lizard house, and I'll show you a picture of how creepy Itzamna is. Yeah, I'm not going to stay on that too long, because that's creepy. About their culture. Their culture is, awesome. They develop a writing system, and they have a complicated writing system, and I wish I could talk to you more about that writing system, but it's not because we can't decipher that writing system like, say, the Indus River Valley people. No, it's because the Spanish conquistadors came and destroyed the texts. They called them heathens, people who worship many gods. They called them all sorts of things, and ruined anything that the Mayans did have. Beautiful temples destroyed, beautiful works of art destroyed, beautiful texts destroyed. It hurts my heart to tell you that, but that's what they did. The Mayans did develop a calendar, and maybe you've heard of it before. It's the calendar that predicted the world would end on December 23rd, 2012. They were wrong, right? So, but they did have a calendar, and it was very, very accurate besides the whole world-ending part. They also developed their own concept of zero, like the Guptas. They developed the concept of zero. Now, that should also go off in your brain. You're like, okay, Mr. Casey, how can the Guptas develop the concept of zero and the Mayan people develop the concept of zero? Who did it? Who did it in reality? Well, both groups did it. The Guptas are of India, and the Mayan people are of Mesoamerica, and they both discovered the concept of zero. It's just that they did it in different places and at different times, and they never actually met together to discuss, okay? So, the answer is both of them did, okay? I don't know if you'll like that answer, but it's the way it is. You see their number system over there on the right-hand side, so I'll keep moving. Another cool feature of Mayan culture, which you see on the right, is a ball game called Poke-to-Pock, where you have to use your hips to hit the ball through that little loop up on the top there. And they also use hieroglyphics in their nature, kind of like the Egyptians. You're using clay, shell, bones, etc. But their game, Poke-to-Pock, is a brutal lacrosse game. In this way, is that you play Poke-to-Pock, using your hips, you bounce the ball and whatever. But if you lose, well, you're sacrificed to the gods. So don't lose, right? Okay. Mayan Collapse. How do they collapse? Well, Spanish conquistadors, of course, is gonna be eventual part of that destruction of culture. But we're not really 100% sure how they collapsed. We think that perhaps there are some ecological disasters, but we're really not too sure, just like our Indus River Valley folk. Cities eventually abandoned, and some not rediscovered until the 1700s, which is incredible because, you know, Europeans arrived in the 1500s. So for 200 years, these cities remain untouched. So there's your poke the puck. And if you're interested, watch The Road to El Dorado. It's a cool little film to sort of shine a light on Mesoamerican culture. It's kind of fun. Don't take it too serious, you know? Okay. Last thing, real quick. Documents to prepare for are shown there. Please, for your short answer test, you've got to know about civil service exams in China and the meritocracy. Know that if you're looking at a source from Wikipedia, that it is not a trustworthy source because anyone can edit Wikipedia, right? That's usually a place where you start, but it's not a place where you end. As far as document 2, you're going to have to look at the fall of Constantinople and see and make sure you know how it fell, particularly the gunpowder, and the gunpowder being traversed through the Silk Road, ending up in the hands of the Seljuk Turks, and we see cultural diffusion change the world. You should know a little bit about Tang and Sung China, the different inventions, and why they might be important. For example, the gunpowder, or for example, movable block printing allows you to get out ideas faster. Knowing about the compass, so that the compass gets in the hands of Europeans and it creates an age of exploration, right? Any of those things. Be able to tell me one invention and tell me why that invention is like a turning point, okay? Document 4 is going to be a map of West Africa. Please know your African geography. The Sahara, the rainforests, know about the Kalahari Desert to the south. Perhaps you'll tell me about the Bantu migration that was caused by rapid desertification in the north and how everyone came down south. You should know about the trans-Saharan trade and how a byproduct of it was the spread of Islam into West Africa because they're trading with Islamic folk, right? You could tell me a little bit about Musa, perhaps, but know about the trans-Saharan trade, gold for salt, and why that was. Document 6 will be some of the Mayan advancements in math and science. So be ready to talk about what did the Mayans do, specifically the calendar, specifically the concept of zero. In document 7, well, you're going to have to look at Mansa Musa and tell me a little bit about a document regarding him. So know your Mansa Musa, a Muslim man from the city of Mali who took a Hajj to the city of Mecca. Okay? All right, guys. Hope that helped, and take care.